Shalom, hello and welcome to another Torah Parsha lesson. Today we are going to be looking at the Parsha Bo, which we find in the book of Shemot, of course, the book of Exodus, beginning in chapter 10, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 13, verse 16. And the word Bo in Hebrew is translated in this particular verse in 10:1 as Vayomir Hashem el Moshe Bo el Paro. So that's, and God said to, and Hashem said to Moshe, come to Pharaoh, Bo, come. So you can also read it as go or come, is in the sense of going towards something or entering into some place. So this is a pretty fascinating Parsha because there are a number of things that happen for the first time in our Parsha Bo, and that's one of those things I'd really like to talk about and focus on today because it's a real integral part to understanding or seeing how Torah functions in regards to relating information to people when they begin to read it. And it is something that I have heard Rabbi Sachs talk about often because Torah is very, very unique in this one instance. So, and what this is the idea or the issue of law and narrative intertwined. So with this Parsha, we see introduced into the flow of Torah a striking feature of Torah that, in my opinion, shows the depth of Hashem's heart and his desire to communicate effectively to all who deem to read, contemplate the Torah, and wrestle with the divine origin of the text. So in other words, how does he make it readable? How does it become relevant to us? What are the mechanics here that are used in the style of communication that allow us to tackle complex issues where we think of it in regards of God asking us to do something and God asking us to not do something? So this is the idea of what we call, or what is called in Judaism, or in a Hebrew term, a mitzvah. So the word mitzvah means a commandment. So you can translate it as commandment or law, but really it's asking us to either do something, so this is what we call a positive commandment, or to not do something in regards to a negative commandment. So the term mitzvah, you will hear it a lot whenever you read in the Hebrew text or read commentaries on Hebrew texts. When you listen to rabbis talking, they will use this term mitzvah often. And that's what they're referring to. So how does God relate, or how can we relate to the idea of mitzvahs, God asking us to do something? And what is this mechanic? And this is this strange utilization of intertwining narrative and the law together. So we've got story, the narrative, the characters involved, and then we've got these mitzvahs as well. So this feature is the combination of law and narrative, and as we read through the book of Shemot and Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, and Deuteronomy or Divarim, we will see the mechanic of communication utilized frequently. So how does this feature of Torah first present itself in this Parsha? So reading chapters 10 and 11, we see a continuation of the narrative of the 10 plagues. And then we get to chapter 12 and we see a remarkable verse. Now, this is how we read it. In the English, the Lord said to Moses and Aharon, Moshe and Aharon in the land of Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt. And that's verse 1. And in verse 2 goes on to say, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. So then we see in chapter 12, it will go on to detail the Pesach offering. So this is the what is supposed to happen on Passover, and in particular, this first Passover. So, which is of course another declaration of law, another declaration of a mitzvah, or in this instance, a number of mitzvahs, because there are a few things that needs to be there are a few protocols that need to be followed when someone is doing what they call a Passover Seder, or doing the Passover meal. So you could call this issues of tradition. There are different types of traditions that have developed through different parts of Jewish communities, different rabbinical ideas behind how to celebrate Passover. But at the heart of it, we find in chapter 12 here the beginning of the details of how to do that. What is God's opinion of what needs to happen on Passover night? So it's interesting, and when we look at the wording, of course, in verse 14, which we've got there, this day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. So it's something that is to be celebrated. And also, I'd like to point out that even though I don't have it on the screen for you, this is one of the first times we see this word statute. So a statute, as a statute forever. And in the Hebrew, this is called a chukat. There are a couple of reasons why I just want to quickly point out why this verse is important to us, because there's something that we've talked about previously in the book of Bereshit, and that is the idea of remembering. And what are these feasts really about? Because as we know, Passover is when we read it in the book of Shemot, Passover is about the Exodus, the night when the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, are led out of, or it wouldn't say so much led, but they're asked very, very forcibly by Pharaoh to please leave because of all the final plague, the 10th plague of the firstborn. So when Passover is celebrated again, and as it points here that this day shall be for you a memorial. We have in that word memorial in the Hebrew, it's zikaron. Okay, so that has the verb in it, zachar, which means to remember. So this idea of remembrance is incredibly important in the way Torah builds community, because it's the story that we share together, our common story that helps build our future and keeps us connected and cohesive, because we learn how to remember and celebrate the testimony and the witness of what has gone before us, that allows us to build today and to build tomorrow. So Passover is just super important when it comes to this idea. It's remembering where we came from, and not just the strong hand that God uses to bring us out of that situation that we were a slave towards, and that's another interesting thing as well when we talk about this, because what does it mean to be a slave? And this is something that I want to pick up later on in this lesson, and that is that what don't you own? What aren't you in control of? What don't you have a say over? And that is the idea of time. Time does not belong to you. And so when you are enslaved to something, when something rules over you and it controls your behavior, it controls your life and controls your day, it controls your time. And so the idea that we can remember and celebrate what we've come out of and the freedom and the agency that we move towards, that becomes our shared story. And it's just incredibly powerful. And there's one other thing I just want to quickly point out about this verse in verse 14 in chapter 12, and where it says a statute forever. So this is chukat olam. So a chukat is a statute. Now, the idea of a statute is quite fascinating, and it is something that we will come back to time and time again when we investigate and learn from other parshas, and that is that it's a statute, or a hukum, statutes, are things that are beyond human reason. In other words, it's something that's it's difficult for us to find language to explain why God asks us to do this. Now, in regards to Passover, it seems a bit simple. It's not something that we can really struggle with. But there are other things, and I look forward to pointing them out to you, that really defy human logic. And we ask the question, why does God ask us to do this? What is going on with this mitzvah, and how does it affect a certain thing in the outcome of our lives when we adhere to this mitzvah? So I want to point that out and just get you to start thinking about how there are issues to mitzvah, there are issues to the law, and that the narrative doesn't help us understand. And maybe we won't ever understand, or maybe we will. Maybe the voice of someone to come, or the voices of people studying now, will develop the idea of that and allow us to find the language for it. And this again is the beauty of studying Torah, because it is a global it's a global phenomenon. It is the great endeavor of humanity is to know God more, and to allow His word, His Torah, to guide us on that journey, to find the language, to somehow learn how to talk about these things. And again, this is Zachar. How do we remember? How do we celebrate this? We celebrate the testimony and the witness of what has gone before us. So when we become aware of this feature within Torah, this feature of law and narrative intertwined, we can engage in a beautiful process. So the process of question and debate. I love that. Argument and compromise. Oh. Again, what's the point here? The point here is, how do we build community around the idea, around the journey, around the daily walk of coming to know God more? And how do we do this together? We do it because we dialogue, we have conversation, questions, debates, arguments. And in our arguments, we have to find compromise, because it's not in our nature to always agree on everything. It doesn't happen. We know, but we find compromise. We find the intertwining of relational choice that allows us to build together. And so we find consensus with dignity of difference. So why does God give us both? And how does this reflect upon the idea of what we think Torah is? So again, law intertwined with narrative. So firstly, I believe that the power of narrative is one of personal reflection. The power of the story in communicating an idea is that we can activate our imagination and thought processes to interact with the narrative. So we literally place ourselves within the context of the story as we perceive it to be. So this is how we come to terms with the moral of the story and see inside the narrative to struggle with what are often complex ideas. And this is the wonderful. This is Again, the idea of story as truth. This is why the use of story to communicate ideas is so powerful, because this is what we do. We are. It's one of the amazing ways that we are created. We're created with this imagination. That is not just this idea of fantasy. And this is something that I find that is incredibly sad about how the modern Western education system works in, what's the term? It works in diminishing our imagination by treating it as if it is just pure fantasy. But isn't that where the wonder of how we perceive things grows? Where our imagination as children, we are literally able to visualize stories. That's why stories and playing and all those things are so powerful as a child, and why that needs to be nurtured, I believe, because when we allow our imagination to flourish and to grow and to mature into this powerful function that God has created in us, then we are able to see complex ideas take shape before us. And what happens then? We learn how to communicate them. So we literally place ourselves within the context of the story as we perceive it to be. And this is key here, because this is what the Torah does. The Torah, the Word of God, adjusts itself according to your capacity to perceive. So the more we read, the more we engage, the more we believe that it is actually interactive, the more we are able to harness the power of our perception to perceive more. And this is why this is so powerful here. And again, this is how we come to terms with the moral of the story. God requires that we build an ethical framework within which community can function. And what's remarkable here is that we don't have to guess at what he believes is the best way to do these things, because we have these mitzvahs, we have these 10 commandments that help us fashion the covenantal agreement of how we relate with one another. So this translates us into a complex interwoven narrative of social and moral ideas that may not be intrinsically obvious to the hearer. And again, the more we learn to engage with the interactive nature of it, the more we become aware of the details. So, why couple law and narrative together? Because the law is a social contract. Think about this. God asks us to do things. We agree or we disagree. So we are entering into a covenant. And isn't that the idea of covenant? Is that two parties agree on something. And I've talked about this before. We have different forms of covenant. A covenant between a strong entity and a weaker entity. Covenants between two balanced entities, so they both have the same amount of strength. So the law is a social contract. It responds to what we do. It responds to our decisions. So think of this in a very natural sense in regards to how law functions within community, within countries. Countries have different laws, but there is an idea there that the law is there to keep order so that people can go about living their lives free of oppression, free of fear, free of harm, knowing that when someone steps outside the boundaries of the law, there are repercussions. Now, this is something that, of course, is interesting in regards to Torah, because the Torah whenever we really look at it, and we look at the idea of a mitzvah, what is the biggest outcome of choosing not to walk in the ways of God? It is the breakdown of relationship. So again, the law responds to what we do. Story is personal. To understand and come to a place of agreement with the social construct of law, we need to see the narrative of people within the environment that the law creates. So how does Torah do this? So the way Torah does this is, it truly is the kiss of heaven, because we are able to see the personal that makes the impersonal manageable. So remember I said at the beginning, the law, from our perspective, often is a social contract. It doesn't have a personality per se, but it responds to what we do. And so in many ways, the law is impersonal, but it's there to make the personal possible. So we see that the way the Torah function here again is that we're able to see the personal, the narrative, making the impersonal, which is the mitzvah, manageable. How do we manage that? How does it function? What does it look like? And we are able to begin to identify with the author. Oh my gosh, with the author of the law, and therefore see the function of the law as a device for personal and social well-being. So we can ask the question, does the law interrupt the narrative? So I'm talking about how the Torah flows here, or does the narrative interrupt the law? Now I propose that the law comes to establish how the ongoing narrative is made possible. So for example, in this Parsha we are reading along, we've got the 8th and the 9th plague. So we have the 8th plague of locusts, and then we have this plague of darkness. Wonderful stuff. And then all of a sudden, the narrative stops, and we have this mitzvah where God says, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. And we're left all of a sudden asking, what? What happened to the story? What's going on here? Why is this here? What has this got to do with anything? And that's the remarkable thing. So the law comes to establish how the ongoing narrative is made possible. And what's the ongoing narrative here? Okay, so what's about to happen? So okay, yes, Passover is coming, Pesach is coming, the plague of the firstborn is coming. The B'nai Yisrael Pharaoh's about to say to them, get out, get out of my country. And what does that mean? We need to stop and we need to ask ourselves, what's about to happen? They're about to become a nation. They're about to have agency. They're about to have the capacity to choose what they do next. And how is that going to work? So what happens? This mitzvah turns up. And then the mitzvah of Passover, as a remembrance, as a memorial throughout the generations, a feast to the Lord, a statute forever. So these things all of a sudden turn up with detail about how the community, the nation as a community, will begin to function. And here's something very interesting. Without this first mitzvah here, this idea of this is going to be the first month of the year, what does that mean? We're going to deal with that. I'm going to get into the nuance of that very soon. But again, what I'm trying to communicate here, because this is something we will see time and time again. We have narrative, and then all of a sudden we have law, and then we come back into narrative. And sometimes the narrative seems to be further back in the past. What is happening? What is happening? So again, the law comes to establish how the ongoing narrative is made possible. And again, I've often turned to Rabbi Sachs here of blessed memory, because he talks about these things, and the way he words them is quite remarkable. So let's have a look at something that he brings up in regards to the commentary on this verse, because this is quite fascinating when you think of why this mitzvah here, why now. So there is a famous comment of Rabbi Yitzhak, which is cited by Rashi at the very opening of his commentary on Torah. So this is right back at the beginning of Genesis Bereshit 1:1. And Rabbi Yitzhak said the Torah should have commenced with this verse. Okay, which verse are we talking about? 12, verse 2. This month shall be to you the first of months. Okay, it's the first commandment given to Israel. So why then did it begin with the creation of the universe? Remember again, questions, debates, arguments, compromise. What is going on here? This is the wonder of who we are and our ability to investigate things. So Rabbi Sachs goes on to talk about this. The answer is less significant than the question, which is, on the face of it, astonishing. Rabbi Yitzhak is asking why was it necessary for the Torah to mention the fact that God created the universe? He goes further. Implicit in his suggestion that the Torah should have begun with the 12th chapter of Exodus is that the entire book of Genesis, the lives of the patriarchs and the birth of Judaism, is unnecessary. So too are the first 11 chapters of Exodus itself, with their account of the sufferings of the Israelites in Egypt, the choices of Moses, the plagues, and so on. So how could he have said or thought such a thing? These narratives are fundamental to Jewish belief. However, Rabbi Yitzhak's question makes good sense. Essentially, he is asking, what kind of book is the Torah? To what literary genre does it belong? That's another very good question. So the word Torah in its narrowest sense means law. Okay, so it also means teaching, to be instructed, to be guided. So, if so, it should have begun with the first law. So is it a book of laws? It's often called, the Torah is the book of law, the laws of Moses. So what's with the narrative at all? Is it needed? And this is what I'm trying to establish here. So we do not expect a textbook on torts or family law or contract to contain a history of England or the United States. If it did, we would conclude that the author was confused. I love how he puts this. Law is one thing, narrative is another. Narrative answers the question, what happened? Law answers the question, how shall I act rightly, and what redress do I or society have if someone acts wrongly? They do not belong in the same book. If then the Torah is a compendium of law, it should not contain metaphysics and history, the creation of the universe and the early story of mankind. So Rabbi Yitzhak has logic on his side. So that why then does the Torah contain both? So the answer goes to the heart of our faith endeavor. See, law is not a series of arbitrary rules according to the Torah, even though it comes from God himself. Nor is it a matter of blind obedience. There is an issue here of choice, but it is not an issue of blind choice. So law is rooted in history and cosmology. It reflects something other and older than the law itself. It speaks to us out of the heart of the human situation. It belongs to a total vision of the universe, the place of mankind within creation, human psychology, and the attempts to create relationships and societies based on respect for human dignity and the natural environment. Beautiful stuff. What is more, we are expected to know the story behind the law. And to me, this is just wonderful. This is This is the heart of a God who desires for us to know him. It's not about an arbitrary set of laws that tell us what we must and mustn't do. God wants us to understand the story behind the laws, why they work. Why do they work? Why do the Ten Commandments work so well when we apply them to society? And why do societies who apply them into the foundation of their legal system, why do they flourish? Because it's about creating a society based on respect for human dignity. The dignity of relationship, the dignity of desiring wellness for one another. So the Torah does not seek to create a society around the naked fact of divine command. God wants us to know not only what to do, but why. Baruch Hashem. He wants us not merely to obey, but also to understand. In early stages of childhood, a parent insists on simple rules. Do this, don't do that. But as the child grows, he or she needs to question, challenge, probe. Successful parenthood depends on taking these inquiries seriously. The mere assertion of parental authority is not enough. Eventually, one of two things will happen. Either the child will rebel, or he or she will fail to develop an adult moral sense. That is why a good parent will, as the child matures, begin to explain why it is important to act this way, not that. So the Torah is God's book to mankind. God is a parent, we are his children, and God speaks to us as adults. He wants us to understand the logic of the law and the history of why it is necessary to have these rules. Not those. This particular structure of commands and constraints. So in short, the Torah, law, and narrative are intertwined for the most profound of reasons, namely that God's law is not arbitrary. It speaks to the human condition. It arises out of human history. God said, the sages, is not a tyrant. He does not issue laws and decrees for his sake, but for ours. Baruch Hashem. Moreover, he wants us to understand the laws so that we can act not by rote, but by educated moral instinct. And this to me is the beauty of what is happening in the book of Shemot, in this Parsha Bo, and what is coming, allowing this, the law comes to explain how the narrative is made possible. The coming narrative is made possible. The lawgiver is also the creator. Therefore, the law goes with the grain of creation. That is the ultimate answer to the question posed by Rabbi Yitzhak. Why does the Torah begin with creation? Because the Torah represents a way of life that respects the integrity of creation and the Creator in whose image we are. So let's dive into what's happening here in verse 2 of chapter 12 with this mitzvah. This idea of Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of months. And we can, and as we do this, we can see this interruption here, this interruption of the law, this law being declared, this mitzvah coming into the narrative is actually a guiding hand that introduces and provides a framework of hope for a people that until now had no capacity to comprehend a future where freedom and responsibility could work hand in hand to provide a national environment of government and peace. So Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. Now this is quite fascinating really, because I remember the first time I heard about this and I was reading about it and looking at what Rashi was saying and trying to understand why this was here all of a sudden. And that is the fascinating idea that God here, his first commandment to the Bnei Yisrael was to create a new calendar system. So we read there in the Hebrew, HaChodesh Chazeh Lechem Rosh Chadashim. So HaChodesh, the month, or this month to you, Lechem, will be Rosh, the head of Chadashim, the months. Okay, it shall be a Rashon. It shall be the beginning. So Rosh here is like the head of the months. It shall be Roshin, the beginning. Hu. So Lachem, to you, shall be a Lechad Shei Hashanah. Shall be the first month of the year. So, what does Rashi have to say about this? And I think there's quite a wonderful commentary that goes into the Chumash here that talks about this verse. It really does lay out things quite beautifully, actually. So this is the first commandment given to the nation as a whole. So an indication that the concept of Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, or the new moon, is very meaningful. So moreover, 1,000 years later in Eretz Yisrael, during the period of Syrian Greek persecution that culminated in the miracle of Hanukkah, Rosh Chodesh was one of only 3 commandments whose observance the oppressors prohibited. So this is the Seleucid Empire, which was came about through one of the generals of Alexander the Great. So this particular general took control over that area. So this is like the Syrian Greek occupation of the land of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. So they prohibited, and this is quite interesting, prohibited 3 mitzvahs that the Jewish people were not allowed to observe in their own land. So one of them was Rosh Chodesh, as the observance of the beginning of the month. So the other 2 forbidden commandments were Shabbat and circumcision. So now it's interesting the commentators point out that Rosh Chodesh was on a level of significance and importance as compared to Shabbat and circumcision. So the commentators go on to talk about this on 2 levels. And just I want to quickly point out, how do they establish when the beginning of the month is? So when you have, and this is something that's quite fascinating as well about the Jewish calendar, because it's based on a lunar cycle, but it's also based on the solar cycle as well. So the counting of the months is based upon the waxing and the waning of the moon. So the beginning of the month is the new moon. How do you establish this? That's important, because this is one of the things that Rashi talks about in regards to Moshe. God says to him, this is going to be the beginning of the months. And he's like, well, what does that mean? How do we tell when it's the first day of the month? And he says, well, it's the new moon. And then you go, well, how do we know what the new moon is? And so this was very important, because how do you establish that? The establishment of the new moon had to be done with 2 witnesses, and they had to be very close to Yerushalayim, and that they were able to go to the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin is the 70 elders of the Bnei Yisrael, and they were the ones who were able to provide governance to the tribes. And so two people had to witness that they had seen the moon in its particular phase as a new moon, and they would come and they would say, yep, we've seen it. We know that this is the beginning of the month. And of course, later on, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin didn't exist. And so they had to be established, because, again, this is really important. Because if you don't know when the beginning of the month is, how can all the other festivals be timed correctly? And this is one of the reasons why the Seleucid Empire, the Syrian and the Greek Empire that was occupying Jerusalem and Israel before the Roman occupation, why they did this, because it they were trying to make it impossible to adhere to the correct timing for the festivals. Because as you will read, and when you continue on in chapter 12, you will see God says something very important about Passover. What does he say? He says, on the 15th day of Nisan shall be Passover. And so you need to know when the beginning of the month is. And if you aren't able to do that, then you're going to get it wrong. And of course, this is not something that you want to do. Because if you get Passover wrong, what are you going to get wrong next? You're going to get Shavuot wrong. Okay, so Shavuot is 50 days from Passover to Shavuot. And then, of course, what follows after that, then you've got all the issues of, well, when does Rosh Hashanah happen? Okay, when does Yom Kippur happen? And here's the other thing as well, is why the calendar also follows the lunar cycle the solar cycle, because it's the seasons as well. So Passover has to take place in spring. If you only follow a lunar cycle, you'll find that there are only 29 days in a lunar cycle, and there are 365 days in a solar cycle. So you will end up, every year you will lose 11 days. And of course, if you keep doing that, then you will find that Passover ends up in summer and then autumn. And it just becomes a giant mess, because then you can't follow the proper festivals for harvest time as well. No, it all just gets very messy. And so what they did is that you'll find that every 3 years that there is every 19 years there has to be there has to be an extra month added within those years 3 times. And so this is what we call when the month of Adar is repeated. So they add 30 days. And this allows it to keep track and to stay on course. So Rosh Chodesh is based upon the testimony of witnesses who observed the reappearance of the moon. And upon this proclamation, the Jewish calendar is based. So unless the new moons can be proclaimed, there is no calendar, and without a calendar there can be no festivals. So thus, if the Syrian Greeks had succeeded in eradicating the observance of Rosh Chodesh, they would have succeeded in eliminating a large number of mitzvahs as well. So on a deeper level, Rosh Chodesh symbolizes renewal, the ability of Israel to rise up from oblivion and restore itself to its past greatness. Just as the moon disappears at the end of each month, but returns and grows to fullness, so Israel may suffer exile and decline, but it always renews itself until the coming of Moshiach, when the promise of the Exodus and the revelation at Sinai will be fulfilled, never to be dimmed again. So this is the essential characteristic of Jewish history, was first exhibited in Egypt, when in the simile of the sages, the nation had fallen to the 49th level of impurity, one level above spiritual extermination, only to renew itself so breathtakingly that after 7 weeks it was able to stand at Mount Sinai and experience prophecy. So I just want to quickly point out something as well that the Baal HaTurim gives us on this verse, and that is, as you will see, there are 3 instances of the word Chodesh, which is the word for month here. And the Baal HaTurim calls this a trebled verse. So the word Chodesh appears 3 times, and between each one there are 3 words. So this indicates, he says, that the first of Nisan, the beginning month, serves as Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, for 3 purposes: for counting the reign of Jewish kings, for the ordering of festivals, and for the numbering of the months. So why is it then that the Torah gives the first mitzvah to sanctify a calendar? And why is this mitzvah considered first in importance? Because you could say to yourself, there could be other things that God could have talked about as the first mitzvah. Why this one? Again, let me emphasize the idea here, and that is that the law comes to help establish how the future narrative is made possible. It's about people. It really is. This it seems strange to say it, but this law is about people and about how they can function with dignity. How they can function with dignity. Because you realize that time has structure to it, you realize that that structure is there to serve you, not the other way around. So self-fulfillment and self-achievement come about when we are in control of our time. Inner freedom comes about through time constraint, through our capacity to schedule our time with focus and precision. This is the heart of sanctifying our time. It does not come about through our capacity to multitask, but rather through our capacity to be fully in the moment and invested both intellectually and emotionally. The act of fulfilling a mitzvah, like this one, allows us to focus our being and provides a truly intellectual and emotionally stable life. Now we can address the question of why this mitzvah would have such a profound effect upon a people who up to that moment couldn't have perceived what a future with self-governance looked like. This is the power of every testimonial mitzvah that follows throughout the Torah. What is the main aspect of scheduling time to create national moments of holiness? Generational remembrance and celebration. Yet a deeper element of nationhood was now being sown into this people who up to this moment were indentured slaves. This is the self-defining purpose of responsibility. Hashem was giving them autonomy over their time and then providing them with the responsibility of governing time on an individual and national scale. Responsibility requires commitment. Commitment produces stability and builds character. So what we see here is really quite an amazing way of communicating that God has encoded into the way His Word works. And that is the capacity for it to become personal. The capacity for us to ponder what is the function of law, what is the function of these mitzvahs, and how does that affect us individually and socially. And through that discussion and through that contemplation, begin to understand and learn about the heart of God towards us. We have the Bnei Israel, a nation that has been in slavery for a while, for a couple of generations. They don't know what it means to be in control of time. So God, the first thing that God does is He doesn't just bring them out and then just say, here's your freedom, go for it. No, He doesn't do that. And for us personally, for me, when I started to learn about this and started to read it, it started to realize that the idea of measuring time is not to constrain me, but allow me to understand that time is there to serve me. It's there to serve us. It's there to serve humanity. And it's not the idea that we will never have enough time. It's the idea that we will always have the time that we need. And that within time, it's important for us to remember. It's important for us to take time to celebrate and to realize that we have such a wonderful shared story together when we walk in the ways of God. And now we can see why the commentators talk about this idea, this calendar system, why it's on such an important level. It's on the same level as what it means to celebrate Shabbat. It's on the same important level of the idea of what covenant is, as portrayed through the covenant of circumcision. It's something that allows us to find common ground and common purpose together, and to understand how God structures and crafts all of this so that we can come to terms with the one who gives us these things. So law and narrative come together to inspire us to unlock the potential we have to perceive the one who brings it to us, the author, the creator, the perfecter of our faith. And it's not so that we find freedom to have to work it out for ourselves, but we find freedom so that we can choose to understand him, so we can choose to understand his ways and walk in such a wonderful relationship with God. So in closing, this is the wonderful thing that I hope to share with you in talking about this subject, and that is that the narrative allows us to witness the struggle of coming to terms with what it means to be free, what it means to have agency, and what it means to be given mitzvahs that allow us to find the structure and the ways of God that make life manageable. And I think this is wonderful because we need that. We really do. We need to realize that these mitzvahs are not there to restrict us, but to help us come to terms with what it really means to have freedom of choice. Because responsibility requires commitment. Commitment produces stability and builds character. And this is something that you will often find talked about in rabbinical writings, is that the mitzvahs build character. It teaches us about ourselves. So when we come across this idea of how do we manage our time, we realize, well, if God is asking us to manage our time, then we're responsible for our time. So we're responsible for what we do with our time. And if I'm responsible with my time, then I can start to ask the questions, why do I do the things I do? How do they reflect upon the way I live my life? What is God's perception of these things? How is he asking me and how is he challenging me to live my life? And how does that affect community? How does that affect family life? And so it helps us to deal with the issue, am I contributing to the stability of society, or am I doing something else? And what does that mean? And so we have these beautiful narratives of watching people do these things. This is why we have Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, the way that they learn how to deal with the reality of God. Then we have Moshe Rabbeinu, who has to learn how to communicate complex ideas that God is giving to him that will form the basis and the structure for a thriving society of individuals who have to learn how to work together for the common good. And the first thing you do is you put in place structured time so that you can remember and so that you can celebrate. Baruch Hashem. Shalom, shalom.